Okay, so we move on to chapter 9 to talk about the mass media and society and the issue of television. And in this case, we are trying to get a little bit of sense of the past 100 years or so of the origins of television and issues about the business operation, television and culture, some issues and trends, and a little bit of influence of the new technologies of what we do to watch television these days. So, what about origins of TV? Well, the mechanical system that was invented by Paul Gottlieb Lipko in 1884 is the foundation for how television ultimately evolved. So, every television system works on the scanning principle, and our chapter tells us a bit about that to help us understand essentially about the rotating disc scanner that was a mechanical process and ultimately became electronic, but it was that system that has allowed us to have television. So the mechanically scanned television was first demonstrated by John Logie Baird in 1926 in London. And again, that's a mechanically scanned system. 1927, Philo T. Farnsworth's invention of the first fully functional all-electronic image pickup device started TV moving into the modern era. The first home TV receiver was first demonstrated in Schenectady, New York in January 1928. Well, television really was not going to get going in the 1920s, but the technology was all in place that would allow it to happen. In 1928, then, by May, a station began occasional broadcasts to the handful of homes in that general area that were given the General Electric built receivers. And again, that's in the Schenectady, New York area. And again, our chapter gives us a little bit more detail about some of those developments. In 1932, the Radio Corporation of America demonstrated an all-electronic television using a cathode ray tube in the receiver and the iconoscope camera tube that was developed by Russian-born physicist Vladimir Zworykin. So a cathode ray tube, a CRT, is what we had as our television device up until just recently. The big picture tube that televisions were before flat screens came along in the last decade, that's what they started with. The cathode ray tube was that picture tube. Well, why did television not get going in the 1930s? At some level, the technology didn't allow it to really be rolled out. But then also there was the Great Depression going on in the 1930s, and there was the buildup going on that ultimately became World War II. Even despite that, NBC started its first regular broadcasts in 1939, and we have a record of the World's Fair being a demonstration of television. And then, of course, you get into the early 1940s, and all the efforts for construction, manufacturing, and basically societal activities were focused on World War II, not on rolling out television. So, early 1940s, a time of lull because of the war. So we then get into the late 40s, mid to late 40s, and as soon as the war is over, things kick into gear for television. 1945, 10,000 sets. By 1950, 6 million TV sets in the home. And then by 1960, 60 million TV sets in the home. And of course, that growth in the 1950s caused radio to have to drastically change and become something different. All the programming that had been on radio moved over to TV, and it is therefore recognized also as the first golden age of television in the 1950s. What about cable TV within all of this? Well, community antenna television started in the late 1940s, right along with the first television systems. Our book tells us a bit more about that. By 1962, there were 800 systems with about 850,000 subscribers. And those were not based on what we know of as cable TV now because there was no satellite distribution. But pay service HBO was started in 1972. And our book doesn't really explain this, but it really was not a satellite delivered service when it started. And then once the satellite use of the programming started, HBO doing that led to people recognizing what could happen. So late 1970s is when that started really rolling out. And because satellite technology evolving during the 1970s. That meant by the early 1980s, companies were recognizing the ability to create a satellite-delivered cable channel, and therefore that growth of satellite channels started in the early 1980s. Deregulation provided by the 1984 Cable Act also allowed expansion. There were 53 million cable TV households by the end of the 1980s. And again, within all this, there was the emergence of satellite TV services that were happening. And then that merged over into the 1990s. And by that time, we had big satellite dishes in people's yards, what our book calls direct to home. So those are still around in some places. Those are the huge satellite dishes that were called a TVRO, a television receive only. And as our book explains to us, basically people could just pick up free channels initially. They bought the satellite dish and had it installed. They had to point the dish toward the different satellites, but they were able to get free channels. And then some regulation changed all of that, and it pushed us toward the home satellite services. And those early ones that were direct broadcast satellite dishes were based on more powerful signals and therefore smaller dishes. We had companies like DirecTV, Primestar, USSB, and EchoStar that started the Dish Network. So we started those as new DBS services, not direct-to-home TVRO-based services. Well, what about over-the-air broadcast TV? Well, the U.S. started with broadcast TV from the 30s and 40s and 50s as an analog delivered signal. And then once we had the development of digital available, countries all around the world started recognizing the need to switch to a digital distribution system. And the United States did that switch fully from analog to digital in 2009. So that means if you had an antenna up in an old TV, those analog signals went away, and what they were sending over the air was only digital information, and you had to have a digital receiver to be able to pick that up. And what came along with that was high definition television that became popular then by 2010, with nearly half of the US watching things in HD. And we have a standard technical system that the US follows based on that standard HD television. Well, of course, now we're moving on to ultra high definition. And so high definition in that technology that started in 2009 had up to 1,080 scan lines, the resolution quality. A 4K picture tube system has 4 times the number of dots on the screen. The scan lines are 4 times as many, and therefore we have what's called ultra high definition that's now emerging. So HD TV back then showed that people were watching primetime TV, which is 7 to 10 p.m. Central Time. People were watching a little bit more because of the HD technology benefit. What about some cultural issues with television? Well, our book tells us a bit about the domestic comedy of the 1950s, and things like Leave It to Beaver, I Love Lucy fit into that, but they depicted generic idealized families. They really left out minorities, and any use of minorities often had a little bit of a stereotypical role rather than a normal, natural role. They didn't address social issues in primetime TV shows and in dramas and sitcoms and so forth, and mostly the shows focused on middle-class whites. The social values of the time were also evident when you look at it. If you look at an episode of I Love Lucy that was produced in the 1950s, or a Dick Van Dyke show that was produced in the 1960s, you see a husband and wife sleeping in 2 twin beds with a nightstand in between. They were not allowed to show them on the bed together in the idea of what it might represent. So just a social kind of a thing there within the way that came across in TV shows. Well, the 1960s and 70s, the TV news emerged in that time period, bringing more reality to the home. Walter Cronkite, one of those famous people that started in the 1960s. The sitcom format became popularized. Our book talks about the Brady Bunch and Bewitched and Beverly Hillbillies and Gilligan's Island and shows like that from the 1960s. So what was happening then? Well, to some degree, television was still ABC, NBC, and CBS, the big three networks, and they were fairly conservative with what they did in their programming. By the 1970s, our book talks about sketch comedy evolving, and that was, of course, with the introduction of Saturday Night Live on NBC, and that benefits from what had happened with shows like Laugh-In and the Smother Brothers in the 1960s on primetime TV. Some call the 1980s a second golden age of television because of what they consider to be kind of the high quality scripted dramas like Hill Street Blues and even sitcoms like Cheers have an impact on that description. And of course, during this time, we have a reemergence of the strength of sitcoms led by The Cosby Show and Family Ties on NBC. And at the same time, cable networks were starting: CNN, ESPN, MTV. Black entertainment television launched in 1980. And of course, because of these cable channels that had different regulatory control, the content on TV shows started becoming more violent and more sex-oriented. 1990s and the 2000s, more specialized cable channels started to emerge. And of course, by the time we get into the 2000s and the impact of the internet, then programming starts to migrate online. And we, of course, have seen the development of Netflix and Hulu and YouTube in those early years, some different services that were tried and failed. And then these days, we now see things like CBS Interactive and Peacock from NBC, Disney Plus from the Disney company that runs ABC. So all those things are a part of all the programming migrating to online. And the conversation in the 1990s of people watching TV and people caring about what was on started moving over to the likes of HBO and ESPN and MTV, and not so much ABC, NBC, and CBS as they had been. So what about the Netflix disruption? Well, they started, of course, as a way of shipping DVDs to people's house for watching movies. But then as they transitioned that over into an online service, they started licensing content from the networks. You have to have programming to put on your channel, and either you buy that programming from the people who own it or you produce it yourself. So the Netflix model originally was about licensing this content from the networks and then focusing on streaming and still doing the rentals. What about subscriptions? Well, about 61 million subscribers to Netflix currently. Compare that to HBO that has about $43 million. And what will happen as these new services from the traditional networks keep growing? Well, it means Netflix will start losing some of its programming. So they recognized, as any of these streaming services do, they had to get into their own original programming. And all this is the issue of the relationship of local area watching and networks and cable TV. Hulu, as a comparison, is another streaming site. It was originally created by NBC, Fox, and ABC. ABC, again, is run by Disney, and Hulu is now controlled by Disney. Got about 32 million subscribers. YouTube wasn't started by Google, but they bought it, and Google is obviously huge platform for streaming video, the busiest TV platform. Every day, people all around the world watch over 1 billion hours of video and generate billions of views. So people absolutely are engaged with YouTube, and YouTube has servers all around the world running that operation for people to access. The issue of TV and culture, where TV news comes to the forefront during a crisis. Our book can talk about historical things like 9/11. These days, we might think about the impact of COVID-19 coverage and think about how TV news covers that, whether or not they've got an agenda or cover it fairly. And when we get into that, we can start recognizing the idea of partisanship in the news networks and the influence that can have. In TV and culture, sometimes TV does address social issues. They do that more now than they did in those early decades. And our book talks about the Ellen sitcom as one example of that. Our book talks about reality television, gives us the reference back to Candid Camera as one of those first kind of reality type shows. But why has it grown so much in recent years? The big issue is the smaller audience size for each channel, which means we can't afford to produce really expensive sitcoms and dramas to fill all the schedule. and reality shows are cheaper to produce. The network's rise and fall is part of the issue of understanding television. In 1950s and 60s, there were ABC, NBC, and CBS. In the early years of the 50s, there was also the Dumont network that didn't make it. But Fox came along to rival the big three in the early 1990s. And as they took some market share away, we started then looking at what we call the big four. But from that time to now, based on cable TV first, and now because of streaming, those big four are getting a smaller and smaller share of that market. So cable had the impact, as it shows here, 43% of people watching one of the big networks in 1994, down to 27% in 2009. This is the most recent year where CBS averaged 7.58 million viewers in prime time, which was down 15% from the previous season. NBC averaged 6.5 million viewers, ABC had 5.4 million, and Fox had 6.3 million viewers. Well, those numbers are really low compared to what the networks had in previous decades. And the whole idea is to compare that to the idea that in the 1960s, it was just CBS, NBC, and ABC that had most of the primetime viewing. There was no cable TV as we came to know it. There was no internet. And so in the Dallas-Fort Worth market, you'd have a few other stations in the market that were independents, and PBS was developed in the late 60s. But if you were watching TV on a Tuesday night in Dallas-Fort Worth in 1968, you were almost certainly watching something on ABC, NBC, or CBS. And back then, the ratings for a show might have been 25, 28%, which meant that when your show was on, 25 to 28% of the population was watching your show. Now, the highest rated show, Big Bang Theory, when it did its series finale, got about 5% of the audience watching that show. So those numbers are significantly down, and that has changed the dynamics, obviously, of network television. What about some other industry trends? Well, cable continued to eat into the network market share, but the internet and streaming is having a huge impact on even cable TV. Our book talks about narrowcasting that happened from cable TV channels, focusing on specific audiences, cable pushing the envelope on explicit content, and of course, so did the networks as a result of that. Satellite TV, DirecTV versus Dish Network are the two big ones now in the DBS service. Both of those compete with a local market area cable system. DVR is popularized in recent years, kind of made the VCR obsolete. The internet with streaming content is competing with all these services now. And we have things like video on demand, where we can buy an individual program to watch. We have interactive TV, where we can have back and forth on a TV service in the same way we do when we're on a web page. And what about talking about the revenue sources? The networks get their money from advertising and from licensing their content. Netflix and HBO Showtime, they sell subscriptions to make their money, and then they license some of the content they have. Cable companies get subscriptions from their subscribers in the local area, but then they don't just sell cable TV, they also sell broadband internet and sometimes phone services. The cable networks can also make money from advertising, and they also can charge the carriers of their channels for the channels. And so a cable network like ESPN, for every individual cable company that carries ESPN, and every satellite provider, DirecTV and Dish Network, those companies pay a fee for carrying that channel. And that, of course, is what keeps making the cable and satellite bills go up. YouTube makes most of its money from advertising. Hulu sells subscriptions, but also has advertising and some licensing of their content. What about a local market TV station, WFAA in Dallas-Fort Worth? Well, they run local advertising, and they bring in some revenue from that. But now they charge the cable operators and the DBS services for carrying their channels. And so whenever those channels go off in a local market area because of some conflict. It's about the rate that they're charging. Screen says DTV, but that should say DBS. That's referring to cable operators and the DBS companies, DirecTV and Dish Network. What about the ownership trend in cable and local markets? Well, all of it is about consolidation. Fewer companies owning more and more of the services. Cable companies and DBS services offer a single pipe for TV, internet, and phone, and that might be a nice bundle and make it convenient, but those prices have gotten pretty high, and people are trying to look for alternatives to that. So what about the third golden age of TV? That's idea of some of the more complex year-long dramas that emerged in recent years, like The Sopranos, The Wire, Breaking Bad. Started in the mid-90s and evolved over the past couple of decades. Shows with anti-hero protagonists and people talking about them and cultural impact in a much more of a way. And within that, there's also kind of the freedom people see from cable and pay TV and what's happening within those changes. So what are the threats then to the television market? Well, advertising is declining on broadcast and cable channels, moving over to the internet. DVR users can easily skip ads, and so people pay for an ad and we don't see it. Of course, there are more and more ad-free services. You can get Hulu as an ad-supported or an ad-free service. Of course, you get Netflix as it currently is, and it has no advertising on it. Viewers are streaming more and more TV types programming using things like the game console, but also a smart TV, connected devices like Roku and Apple TV, and giving up those DBS and cable subscriptions. So we call those people cord cutters. People are giving up those paid subscriptions for the multi-channel services and to some degree putting up an antenna again, like the people used to have to in the days before cable, and getting free over-the-air antenna television. There is an issue about where you live, because if you live in Dallas-Fort Worth immediate area, you can pick up stations that are in that area with that free antenna over the air. If you live out in Commerce, you're not going to pick up those signals very well. We also have to recognize that what we currently have is ATSC 2.0 as the digital TV technology. And this year they're starting to transition over to 3.0. And that 3.0 will be a drastic difference in what the over-the-air signal is. And it will not be compatible with our current TVs. The antennas will pick up the signal, but you'll have to have a new receiver to pick up that 3.0 signal that will become more like a digital distribution over a cell phone system. It's different than that one-way signal we currently get from the ATSC 2.0 system. So will over-the-air television go back to mostly advertising revenue and not be getting money from the cable companies and the satellite delivery companies? Might mean some new business models happening there with them in the ATSC 3.0, offering a citywide Wi-Fi type of a service, offering some streaming. So some unknowns about where the future of television is based on the internet, but also then based on what might happen as we evolve over into ATSC 3.0 starting this year and moving forward in the future years. So let's look at a little bit of review then from some of the things from this chapter. The two key inventions in the 1880s that paved the way for television to emerge were the cathode ray tube and the mechanical disc system. Our book says television broadcasting began as early as what year, when the Federal Radio Commission authorized inventor Charles Jenkins to broadcast from W3XK, an experimental station in the Maryland suburbs of Washington, D.C. That happened in 1928. What were the commercial television networks that emerged in the 1930s and beginning to broadcast regular programs? Well, they were two of the ones that had radio services, and that was NBC and CBS, that offered some regular commercial television services beginning in the 1930s. Although it didn't become available until the 1950s or popular until the 1960s, the technology for producing color television was proposed as early as what year? and demonstrated by John Logie Baird in what year? So color TV first proposed in 1904 and then actually demonstrated in 1928, but the technology didn't allow that to really be practical in those early years of television, even though it was demonstrated that it could be done. What decade proved to be the golden age of television, during which the medium experienced massive growth in popularity? Well, we think of the golden age of TV being the 1950s. The popularity of what TV programs genre plunged at the end of the 1950s when it was discovered that most of the shows were rigged. That was based on the quiz show scandal of the 1950s. Formerly known as what? Cable television was originally developed in the 1940s in remote or mountainous areas, including in Arkansas, Oregon, and Pennsylvania, to enhance poor reception of regular over-the-air television systems. So it's originally known as community antenna television, CATV. Despite the mostly sanitized view of the world of the 1950s television, in March 1954, what journalist broadcast an unflattering portrait of U.S. Senator Joseph McCarthy on his show See It Now? Well, one of our famous early TV news people was Edward R. Murrow. Around the same time as TV covered John F. Kennedy's assassination, horrific images from where were streaming into people's living rooms during what is known as the nation's first televised war. Well, that would of course be in the 1960s, and therefore that's Vietnam. What sketch comedy show premiered on NBC in 1975 and has remained on the air ever since? Well, you should know Saturday Night Live is that show that's on Saturday night on NBC. Launched in 1980, what was the first television network in the United States dedicated to the interest of African-American viewers? So because of satellite delivery, they were able to develop Black entertainment television and introduce that in 1980. In showing the partisan newsland of modern TV news, our book lists which ones is having more conservative viewers and which is having more liberal viewers. And so they list, for example, Fox News, that is more conservative, and essentially all the nightly network news, ABC, NBC, and CBS, plus MSNBC and CNN as some of those dominant liberal slanting television news programs. In discussing the rise and fall of the network, Chapter 9 discusses affiliated stations, where what is an affiliate and then what is an O&O. Well, an affiliate is a local station carrying a network's programming, but not owned by the network. And then O&O refers to an owned and operated station by the network. So in our Dallas-Fort Worth area, WFAA is not owned by Disney ABC. It's actually owned by Tegna, which is connected to the company Gannett that runs USA Today. And then the other major stations in the market, NBC, CBS, and Fox stations, are owned and operated by their networks, so those are O&O stations. After losing $1 billion each, parent companies CBS and Time Warner agreed to merge UPN and WB, resulting in the creation of what network in 2006? And that is the CW network. CBS and Viacom had split, and then just recently they have re-merged as one company. What two key factors influenced the rapid growth of television, cable television networks? Well, that was industry deregulation and the use of satellites to distribute all those channels. Whereas the broadcast network sought to obtain the widest audience possible by avoiding programs that might only appeal to a small minority of viewers, cable channels sought out niche audiences within specific demographic groups, and that process became known as not broadcasting, but narrowcasting. AT&T launched what? The first active communication satellite on July 10th, 1962. Our chapter tells us about the launch of Telstar. What was the first direct broadcast satellite system, followed shortly afterward by which ones? Well, Primestar, and then DirecTV and Dish Network came along shortly thereafter, and there were some other companies in those early days that in part were absorbed into DirecTV. Despite the facts in our book being somewhat years old, recent years cord cutting makes the major DBS numbers pretty close to accurate. So as our book tells us, DirecTV has about 19 million subscribers and Dish has about 14 million subscribers. The main technology that made VCRs obsolete, like the TiVo, allows viewers to select and record shows they can watch at a later time, is a DVR. And as always, read through the chapter, use the key takeaways at the end of each section, and this gives us a little bit of an overview of things related to the television industry. Next week, we move on to talk about the music industry in Chapter 6.